Don't let your dwarves come up short. Hello, everyone. I am Bront CatHerder, and we're having some fun talking Raid Shadow Legends, and we are working on my DERP through Faction Wars series. This time we're talking about dwarves, and lots of short jokes probably in here. I'll see if I can avoid them, but dad jokes are kind of a thing I like to do. But regardless, dwarves, they're short, they're mighty, they've got a faction, and we want to fight through it. So first of all, we are going to talk about quickly, what does derping through Faction Wars mean? Well, derping is about building teams to identify parts of a team. So in your team, you need damage, because you need to kill your enemies. You need enhancers, because you want to buff yourself and debuff your enemies. So this helps you deal additional damages or helps you take more turns. And then revivers, because you're probably going to die at some point in time. A lot of these faction wars are built to kill you at least once. So being able to bring yourself back to life gives you an escape valve, giving you 1 to 3-star each level at least once. And finally, protectors. They provide the heals, the buffs, and the control so that you can take less damage. Maybe you don't need the revivers all the time. Overall, this is what you build a team around. So enough way to tank through the waves, do damage, clear the waves, and move on to the boss and defeat the boss. So we're aiming for Faction Wars 21, so a lot of this is discussing Faction Wars 21, but these will help you through all of the waves. So let's go take a look at the rares. Now, Dwarves is actually one of the newer factions, but they actually have an amazing amount of rares, quite a few, in fact, more than some of the other factions out there. There are a few really, really good rares in the faction. I really like a Veer as a support. A Veer provides some increased turn meter. He provides some healing. He provides a decreased attack. He provides some decreased accuracy, I believe. Does an AoE as well. Even has a few poisons. Not that the poisons are a big deal. A Veer is a very good early rare to invest in. He's not necessarily a rare you're going to bring past 5 stars, although I've considered bringing a Veer for Faction Wars 21 and 6-starring him for such a case. As far as the other ones are concerned, a lot of the voids are useful. Bulwark is actually really good in Clan Boss, but can also be used for a single target damage dealer because he provides decreased defense and weaken and burns, and just has a couple of other benefits to his passives as well. Dilgul can smack really, really hard for a rare, so if you need some damage, Dilgul is certainly an option. He is, however, a little squishy, although honestly, most of the dwarves are kind of tanky. Kurzad can be a very good enhancer. He provides some weaken. He provides some other buffs as well to increase your accuracy, so he can be helpful early on if you're struggling with some of the stat requirements. Finally, Master Butcher is actually really good as far as a protection champion is concerned. He has some provokes. He also heals if he takes damage. So if he takes some damage, he heals everybody else some of the damage that he takes. And if he dies, he revives another random ally. He's actually really good for Bommel. So if you're struggling against Bommel, Master Butcher could be brought in. Master Butcher substitutes for Vogoth and a lot of teams that are built for Vogoth. So Master Butcher is a good rare to invest in. He's actually a good rare to have on your account. Whether or not you're going to use him against Faction Wars 21, it'll probably depend. But he's not bad for doing that, especially because he's got the random revive, which can give you some extra chances to come back. And the extra healing can be really, really good. So those are some of the rares. Let's go take a look at the epics. They're certainly a little more interesting. All right, so the dwarves are the home of the famous Geomancer, or infamous, depending on if you have him or not. Geomancer is a beast of a champion. He is a great champion to have for Faction Wars, and I'm starting off with him because Geomancer is one of the few epics that fills 3 roles very well. Geomancer has an HP burn, which can do additional damage. He can actually hit fairly hard with his A2 and okay with his A1. But what he's known for is the reflect damage that he does on his burns as a passive. So when he has his burn out, anybody who attacks your team, some of that damage gets reflect back to whoever has the burn on them, plus some additional hits for max HP. Basically, it is a Giant Slayer style bonus hit for damage. Very, very good champion, but there's a lot more to his kit as well. He also does some turn meter steal on the A3 and places a weaken, so he does some additional enhancement for that as well. His A2 can steal buffs, or at least strip buffs if he doesn't actually have burn. If he has the burn on, he'll steal the buffs. If he doesn't have the burn on, he'll only just strip them. Still very, very useful in several cases for Faction Wars. And then finally, as A1, being a big AoE can be very nice. You can even put him in some sets. He's a very versatile champion. But also his A1 is an AoE that hits decently hard, as I mentioned before, that provides decreased accuracy as well. It's not a super reliable decreased accuracy, but any decreased accuracy could help depending on what you're looking at. Outside of all my gushing review of Geomancer, we also have Gala Longbraid. She is a wonderful damage dealer. She's kind of a mini Rhodos. She does extra turns. She's got tankability because she puts shields on herself. She does an awful lot of damage, pretty easy to build for damage as well. Isn't super squishy, although she is an attack-based champion, so she's only so much tank that she can have. It is all single target damage, but again, we're talking mini Rhodos. Rhodos is one of the best single target damage dealers in the game. Gala is very good. Morag can be very helpful. Morag does a lot of counterattacking. She can hit fairly hard. She also brings a strengthen, so she brings some protection along with her damage as well. Isbiel can bring some bombs and can hit fairly hard as well, different damage. And Filja can actually be built to hit fairly hard as well, as far as damage dealers are concerned. In the enhancement category, I mentioned Geomancer because he also throws a weaken up there. I forgot to mention that. Fodbor provides decreased defense, AoE. I believe he's one of the only ones in this faction that's not a legendary. Can be very useful, definitely worth thinking about bringing. His kit's not the best, though he does have some stuns and some decreased turn meter, and I believe some buff steal as well in his kit, but he's not necessarily a great champion, but he's not bad. If you need to bring him along, you bring him along. Rugnor can bring decreased defense, can bring some weaken, can bring some burns. I believe they're mostly single target, but he's still a very useful champion. He's also good for doing damage in clan boss, so he's not a bad champion as well. Dazdirk is the other enhancer that's really, really good in here. I like Dazdirk. Dazdirk is actually very similar to a Veer as far as how his kit works, which is part of why I like him. He has a big heal with a cleanse. He's got turn meter boost. He provides additional continuous heals, and he provides even some leeches on his A1. Very useful, also provides an increased attack as well. Got a lot of support. He's kind of a mini-ish arbiter of sorts. Very, very good utility, lots of healing. I highly recommend building one if you get him. He can even be useful in arena for you. As far as revivers are concerned, we have Melga, who's also got some decent shields and some continuous heals as well. Her revive is not great. It's probably one of the lesser revives as far as the revivers are concerned, as far as epics. She's got the extra shields. She does some protection. She does a little bit of healing. She overall does just enough to make her a good epic to bring along. She's even got a usable aura for Faction Wars. It's actually an all-area aura, so she can be very useful for that. Definitely worth bringing along. Maybe you can get away with only 50ing her. Maybe you need to 6-star her. As far as protectors are concerned, we've already talked about Geomancer with the turn meter steal, Morag with the strengthen. Demitha is one of the queens of clan boss. She provides the unkillable on a 3-turn cooldown. She provides continuous heals and buff extension and debuff reduction. So she can be a very good champion as well. She, if she's fast enough, can carry your Faction Wars team. She can basically protect you against the boss and keep the boss from doing damage. Overall is a great champion to have, very useful to bring on. Rockbreaker's got some interesting protection abilities as well. Rockbreaker will occasionally ignore damage, and that can make him very useful against the boss. Back before there was an expansion of the roster, Rockbreaker was one of the critical champions to bring along because his passive would allow him to tank that big hit from the boss, and you would basically have to hope that Rockbreaker was the target and he didn't take the damage from the boss when the boss hit. So we'll talk about the boss a little bit later. Grizzled Jarl can be useful. He does okay amount of damage, but he brings a decreased attack and some other protection as well, including some increased defense. Cornelia can bring some sleep, so she brings additional control and some healing as well. Rearguard brings some increased defense as well as ally protection. More of a clan boss champion and kind of an early to mid-game clan boss champion, but can be very useful against the boss. And again, we've mentioned Dazdirk, so that covers all the epics. Let's take a look at the legendaries. All right, the dwarves generally have some pretty top-tier legendaries. Some of these have stretched a little bit, but overall, let's just go over the legendaries one by one. Trunda is a legendary damage dealer. She was Queen of Arena for a while. She's currently Queen of Hydra because she hits really, really hard, and she's got a lot of base HP, so she's actually fairly tanky. So if you've got a Trunda, bring along all the damage you'll probably need for Faction Wars. Under Priest Brogni is a great champion as well. He's got a shield that does some reflect damage when you do damage to the shield and heals your champions with the damage dealt to the shield as well. He also brings block debuffs, so he can block the debuffs as well. He brings a burn if you bring accuracy on him, and he increases his shields, so you can drop the shields up and then revive them and increase the number of shields. Brogni is a great champion. He'll help bring you through Faction Wars really easily if you've got one. Herndig's one of the better damage dealers in this faction. Herndig does debuffs. He does turn meter drop. He does decrease defense. He does decrease accuracy. He does weaken. He hits really, really hard as well. He is a very, very good champion. I like using him on my alt to solo Smitatar. I use him to campaign farm. I can campaign farm Nightmare with him. He's usable in arena early on and mid game. He falls off a little bit when his damage kind of falls off a little bit. He is one of the best champions for Dark Fae, and he is one of the best champions as far as damage dealers for this boss because he has the turn meter drop. The turn meter drop means that you can make this boss a lot easier to kill because you can basically get almost a full extra turn if you've got Herndig tuned right. Godfred can do a decent amount of damage. He's got some AoEs. He's got some increased defense. He's also got a passive that instead of dying, you ignore the damage and you get a block damage placed on you with the passive. That can make the boss really easy because the boss's first attack that would normally kill somebody doesn't actually do any damage at all. So Godfred is great for Faction Wars. He's actually a decent champion in Arena. He's a decent champion overall. He does a decent amount of damage. He also provides AoE stuns as well. Mountain King is one of the OG HP damage dealers. He is a single target damage dealer. He does a decent amount of damage. The reason that he's still good in this faction, even though he's fallen off quite a bit, is he is so tanky because he has the most base HP of any champion in the game, and he does damage based off both his attack and his max HP. So he can be very, very good against the boss because the boss can't actually kill him with a single hit if he's got a decent amount of HP. And Mountain King kind of ramps up his damage as he goes and eventually can kill things pretty easily too. So he's a good blend of tankability as well as damage, decent for Faction Wars. Borgar's okay. He's got some protection. He's got increased resistance. He's got some decent shields. If you've got him, he's a decent champion to build for Faction Wars. Probably not going to be key. Granjar, you can ignore him. I think he's one of the last, if not the last, champion you get from Hard Doom Tower. So he's 6 or 7 in on Hard Doom Tower. You're not going to get him by the time you're doing Faction Wars. It's not worth it. I like Nari, but Nari is not a very good champion. He can do okay damage. He's got some provokes on him. He can do some stealing of buffs. He can do some decreased accuracy and decreased resistance, making it a little easier to get out some stuff. He's got some automatic counterattacking. He's got some buff stripping. He's okay. He's got some uses. He's actually not bad in Hydra, but he's not a great champion. He's just kind of missing something to be really, really good as far as utility is concerned. Again, I like him. I think he's not a bad champion to build for progression, but he's not an amazing champion. He's not going to carry your account through Faction Wars. Molly is a great champion. Molly provides a 2-turn provoke. It's a 1 or 2-turn provoke, but she just places it, which is great, especially for Hydra, because she can place it through things like Poison Cloud. A very reliable provoker on a 3-turn cooldown, has a very good revive as well, and she provides some turn meter boosting if you hit her. She provides turn meter boost to herself and to everyone else every time she takes some damage from an attack. So very good at enhancing your team, can actually hit fairly hard as well. If you make her tanky as a reviver though, she'll be good for the faction. Plus the revive is actually pretty good because it also puts block damage on, so a champion that gets revived has actually got some decent amount of protection on them for a turn to get a turn to do something. Samar, he's gotten a buff. He can solo Bommel if you've got the gear for it. Very specific gear, very, very difficult to tune. I don't like him for Faction Wars. He's okay. He can do a little bit of damage. He can self-buff and protect himself. Maybe he's okay for the boss. I don't think he's great. And I think if you're investing for Faction Wars, that's really the only place you're going to use him other than maybe soloing Bommel. But there's easier epics that solo Bommel better than Samar does. So Kira is one of the fusion champions for Mikage, so you're probably going to build 1 to 6-star anyway if you get her. She has some ally protection. She's actually decent in clan boss, and ally protection can be very good against the boss, so she's got some utility against the boss. And even without booking her, she can certainly be useful against the boss and maybe worth building if you've got one. Newt was a recent-ish fusion. Hopefully you got him, because Newt is one of the best champions in the game. I've said that about a lot of champions. There's a lot of different use cases, but Newt has A1 turn meter or freeze control. Newt has an AoE A2 that smacks fairly hard, that does decrease attack and gives him a counterattack and puts weaken up, so he goes good as an enhancer. He hits fairly hard on both of those, so he's got some damage. And then finally, he's got an A3 that is a 3-hit max HP hit. This will decimate most bosses in the game. He's a boss killer. This will be very good against this boss as well, because he can possibly destroy this boss in one shot of his A3 if he's built well enough to do so. Probably not. You're probably going to have some pretty insane gear, but he can definitely help against the boss. And as a defense-based champion, he's super tanky as well. Tormund is another great champion. Tormund can be built for damage. Tormund can be built for control. Well, control works better for arena. In Faction Wars, the damage may be helpful. He does a freeze whenever the enemy gets a buff or a turn meter increase. So he's very good at freezing the enemy. So he's very good at freezing the waves and controlling them. He also provides some provokes. He's also really good in a stun set. He's got an AoE A1 and an AoE A3 as well. And his A2 can strip buffs, which is nice. So very good champion for Faction Wars. There's a couple different ways you can build him. Definitely help you if you've got yourself a Tormund. Acresia is one of the original max HP champion dwarves. She has a 2-hit A2 that's an AoE, possibly max HP, but she does some decent amount of general damage with it as well. She's got an A3 that does turn meter drop as well, and she's got an A1 that's a decreased defense, and none of those require any accuracy, especially against bosses or champions that have more HP than she does, which a lot of these waves will also as well. So she can be very, very helpful, and she's a killer against the boss. Finally, Senna is one of the newer champions. I actually had to do some research on her because I had not actually heard of her, so she might actually be fairly new in the past patch or two. Senna is a fairly standard healer reviver. She's got a fairly good kit. She provides turn meter boost. She provides increased speed. She provides continuous heals. She constantly is activating those continuous heals. She's providing turn meter boost if those continuous heals are activated, and she's got a very good revive as well. So very good champion, probably the best reviver in this faction. I don't know where she is long-term as far as how powerful she is. I need to play around with her a bit more, but she seems like a champion that can be useful in a lot of content if you're lacking a reviver or you're looking for continuous heals for long-term battles and you want that extra turn meter as well. So let's go take a look at the boss. I've mentioned the boss a few times as there are a couple champions that counter the boss. Let's go take a look and see how you would attack this boss with these dwarves. So dwarves have the red boss, and if you're not familiar with the red boss, this is the boss that will stun everyone except for the one target he's going to attack, fear that target, and then make an immediate next turn and attack that target. He always ignores defense with his A1, and his A1 is usually enough to kill most champions. And then he'll keep attacking with that A1 until he gets his stun recovery back. Where he is also difficult is when you do damage to him, it boosts his turn meter, so it's very hard to prevent him from taking turns. Decreased speed can be helpful for him to slow him down a bit, but stealing or taking his turn meter, which I've mentioned 3 champions at least in this faction that will actually flat out take turn meter, can be very, very helpful against controlling this boss and preventing him from getting a turn. Other things that can be helpful are things like damage mitigation. Geomancer provides some damage mitigation with his burns. You actually get 15% damage reduction for people attacking. Ally protection is another great way to deal with the boss. Finally, block damage can be very helpful as well because you've got Demytha that can do the block damage. So if you can time your buffs or debuffs well, it's actually a very easy boss to get through. You protect yourself with the right protections, you keep your team alive, you get some reflections out. If you've got Brogni or Geomancer, he does a couple of hits. Maybe he does kill somebody, but he does a bunch of damage to the champion, so he'll reflect a bunch of damage to himself, and then finally you revive, and then you kill him. There's a lot of damage and there's a lot of tankability in this faction. This faction tends to have more HP than other champions in other factions, and that can be very useful because while this does ignore max HP and is an enemy max HP hitter, they still need to do that much max HP. So having a high max HP can still keep your team alive against this boss. So there's plenty of different options for this boss. Let's go take a look at some of the recommendations overall. All right, so here are the general recommendations we've got. There's obviously I've talked about some of the DERP, so the damage, the enhancement, the revivers, and the protectors. There's a decent amount of protectors here. There's not a lot of enhancement. That always seems to be a case where a lot of these factions are lacking. The ones that are here are really, really good. As you'll see, Geomancer shows up an awful lot. It's hard to not recommend him if you've got a Geomancer. I realize not everyone's going to have a Geomancer, but if you've got a Geomancer, he is amazing. And if you don't have a Geomancer, then you kind of need to fill in the damage and some of the other stuff somewhere else as well. I recommend Melga as a reviver. She's accessible because she's an affinity epic. However, if you have Molly or Senna, especially if you have Senna, Senna will probably help you carry you through this faction pretty easily. Again, Geomancer, highly recommended. If you don't have a Geomancer, you're probably going to need to fill in with damage dealers and or protection to make up for it. And I really like Avir or Dazdirk. So if you have no Dazdirk, then you can certainly use an Avir. In fact, he's the only rare I've mentioned as a specific recommendation up here. But very, very good champion, can definitely help keep you alive. It'll probably depend on what else you have in the faction as well. As far as additional damage is concerned, I really like Gala. I really like Morag. And if you have a legendary, a lot of the legendaries do damage, so you'll just use a legendary. Beyond that, you've got some flex spots. So you can use Fodbor. Fodbor will make the waves a lot easier. Otherwise, more damage, more protection. Plenty of different options here, both in the epics and obviously in the legendary category for that. If you're really struggling, maybe you bring Melga and a Molly or and a Senna, or even two Melgas. There's a couple different options with that as well. Overall, there's enough damage in this faction to get through this boss fairly quickly. If you do enough damage, you're really going to have to deal with the boss going one time, and that'll make it a lot easier for you to revive and then kill the boss. So let's go take a look at my team just so that maybe inspire you for what I did to get through this. So here is my team. I did not have an awful lot of damage. As you can see, I built Gala specifically for this. In fact, I had 60'd her and was leveling her up and did some masteries on her and just ran her with most of her masteries. She was definitely very helpful because I really didn't have a lot of damage. At the time, there were not as many damage dealing champions in the faction, and I didn't have a dwarf legendary. In fact, Dwarves was the faction that took me the longest to get a dwarf legendary of any kind whatsoever. Geomancer, hard carried. You can see all the damage he did. A lot of that was reflect damage. Some of it's from the burns. Some of it's just from his A1 doing a decent chunk of damage. I think he was actually in my clan boss team at the time, so he was actually not particularly fast, so I could have built him a little bit better. Cornelia brought some additional healing and support. She's got the sleeps as well. Definitely was helpful in getting through the waves, but didn't make it particularly fast. Mentioned Gala did a bunch of damage. Demitha doing an awful lot of healing, and on top of that, bringing a lot of damage protection with that unkillable that we had. And then finally, Runekeeper Dazdirk keeping me cleansed, keeping me alive, spurring me on with turn meter, adding some increased attack to make Gala do even more damage. Very, very clutch champion. So that was my team. Obviously, it took me a long time to manual it, but I did manage to manual it, and I managed to get through it. I believe you guys can too. So until next time, I'm Bront CatHerder.